There were others, of course, besides Voltaire and Montesquieu, who challenged the political and religious authorities in 18th century France. And of these, Denis Diderot was amongst the most influential. He too, like Montesquieu and many of the others, were terribly influenced by the example of the English Enlightenment and by the British theorists. And it began to turn him away, in fact, from the original practice of the religion into which he had been born, and in fact, which he decided to follow. Diderot began life in the seminary and in fact was going to become a priest. But reading the theorists moved him first towards deism and then ultimately almost into atheism. By the 1740s, Diderot, increasingly radicalized, frequented the company of other philosophers who were in some instances even more radical than he, such as Rousseau, and he met his great collaborator in the process of creating the encyclopedia, Jean d'Alembert. And Diderot began to attack Christianity and the Roman Church with the same kind of fervor that Voltaire had previously. And he began to argue that religions based on divine revelation were by definition unnatural, that they were antisocial, that they were, of course, irrational. Therefore, he said, they were dangerous, they were disruptive of society, and they had to then be controlled to allow reason to operate. He didn't, though, leave this just to religion. He believed it also true about absolutism, that, like Montesquieu, he saw absolutism as a particularly dangerous operation. He also saw nationalism, well, what we now call nationalism, and that is the willingness to kill or be killed for something that is of no great value to the other members of the community, as also irrational and dangerous to society. But these are negatives. These are the things that Diderot did not like, and these are the things against which Diderot wrote with some great rhetorical ability. But what about his positive contributions? What did he do that added to the age of reason, to the Enlightenment that in fact helped shape France and Europe on the verge of the revolution? Well, Diderot believed very strongly that all citizens have a stake in the freedom of the nation. And that meant that they need to be encouraged to make their opinions known. There needed to be public debate, and that public affairs and private beliefs should be constantly reevaluated. They should be discussed, that everyone should be involved in this discussion because these things had enormous influence over their lives. However, if there's going to be rational discussion and debate, there needed to be correct information to make sure the debate did reflect exactly the reality that was being discussed. And to make this information available, to make enough correct information for public debate accessible to all literate people, Diderot, his collaborator Jean d'Alembert, and other associates set out to bring all knowledge together into one enormous publication, the Encyclopédie, or the Encyclopedia. This, of course, was one of those acts of enormous self-confidence that we see so often in the Enlightenment. The idea that you could bring together all knowledge into one publication was in itself an act of almost hubris, but it was also seen by men like Diderot as something that was necessary. It took over 20 years, between 1751 and 1772, for this massive work of scholarship to appear in 28 volumes. 17 of these volumes were text, but 11 were plates, illustrations, to indicate clearly exactly what was being discussed and to make clear through images those things that could not be easily described. And again, taking some of the examples from science. It was to be paid for by subscription. Individuals, 1,000 subscribers initially, would put money forward and they would receive the volumes as they appeared. To indicate exactly how revolutionary this book was from the beginning and its intent, all we have to do is look at its title page that asserted that the purpose of the encyclopedia was, quote, to change the general mode of thinking. Of course, this revolutionary text would come up against the heavy hand of the church and the state. Absolute monarchs hate encyclopedias. So, confronted with the clumsy royal censorship, and also by the Jesuits, who were extremely angry about the very idea, the license to print was rescinded. But that didn't mean that the books didn't continue to be produced. because there were very sympathetic supporters, intellectuals at court, powerful men, in fact, at Versailles itself, that had sympathy with the idea of the encyclopedia. And to be fair to Diderot, he was given an offer by Catherine the Great of Russia to move the whole operation there. Catherine was a great friend and supporter of Diderot. Diderot spent time in St. Petersburg with Catherine, and Catherine bought his library. But he wouldn't leave France because he saw this as something that had to take place in the context of the French Enlightenment. And with one of the great ironies is that after the suppression of the Jesuit order in France, that the last volumes of the encyclopedia were actually produced on the Jesuit printing presses. But what was the audience of the encyclopedia? Just those 1,000 subscribers who had paid their money and expected the volumes as they appeared, like the Book of the Month Club? No, not at all. It was the entirety of literate France, in fact, literate Europe who could read French. As with Voltaire, Europe had been prepared for the reception of new ideas because of the popularity of the French language and the activity of men like Voltaire in popularizing complex ideas. The encyclopedia then publicized the ideas and the views of the philosophers beyond the Parisian circles of the salons into the mass of the population. Literate Frenchmen in the provinces now had access directly to the thought of men like Voltaire and Diderot, D'Alembert, Rousseau, the economist Turgot, the naturalist Buffon. So what had been previously the thoughts of a small number of privileged Parisian intellectuals now became the common property of the literate population and entered their sphere of influence and knowledge. The encyclopedia then was by definition a revolutionary book. It was a manifesto of new ideas, a catalogue of Enlightenment opinion, written with style and richly illustrated. Also, it was self-consciously critical of every received opinion in established institution. They all had read Descartes, they all understood the discourse on method, and they knew that all knowledge, all received wisdom had to be reviewed to determine what should be kept and what should be rejected. Whatever survived stayed as part of the canon of orthodox rationalist thought. But what was found wanting, the irrational, the superstitious, or the merely incorrect, was coldly revealed. A reading public prepared by Voltaire and Montesquieu was ready, and the perspective of the philosophers as expounded in the encyclopedia became enormously influential throughout not just France, but anywhere that the French language reached. That said, the encyclopedia cannot and must not be thought of as an enlightened catechism, because it was produced by a large number of contributors, all of whom were sympathetic to rationalism and to the ideas and principles of the Enlightenment. But they saw very different problems, and they saw very different solutions. And although Diderot and D'Alembert as editors gave them some kind of general shape, the individual contributors were allowed to express their own opinions. This was, after all, the world of the Enlightenment and of open, free debate, as long as your information was correct. In fact, the existence of the encyclopedia itself was an argument against systems. Diderot saw it as an instrument, as a vehicle, because he believed strongly that with enough correct information, the natural reason of men and women would see the true and the good, and consequently avoid error, superstition, bigotry, and falsehood. Also, we have to note, and this becomes extraordinarily important in the next century as well as the 18th, the idea of science as progress entered the Western consciousness widely through the encyclopedia. In part, this was obviously a consequence of the rationalism of the Newtonian foundations of the entire movement of the Enlightenment and the rationalist emphasis on empiricism and the demonstrable proof. But then the idea of science itself as determining what is absolutely and verifiably true, allowing then those things that were allowed to be subject to individual interpretation to become clear. These things become important, and then science as truth becomes part of the collective unconscious of Europeans. As a consequence of the encyclopedia and the ideas that those articles put forth to a literate population, even those things most sacred to Western Europeans could be questioned. For example, the Comte de Buffon, one of the great naturalists of all time, discarded in his article, creation as described in Genesis. He says, it's clear, and it's clear from my studies, that animals evolve over time. And his suggestion, though, didn't have the conclusive evidence that Darwin would provide. But nevertheless, he in fact said, Genesis is a fable, and the change in the evolution of animals is something that I can prove scientifically. So what this means is that nothing was too sacred to be challenged and reviewed, and if necessary, rejected. The dictates of reason, then, could call anything into question, and the dictates of reason could determine precisely how the shape of the world was to unfold and the principles that that world would then employ in order to achieve those Enlightenment goals of a society that was useful, fair, and just. Well, all of these ideas were explosive, of course. And we're living in a world where one bomb after another was exploding around the minds of Europeans as everything that they had accepted and believed and had been taught as true now became questioned. And as evidence began to appear, they were left somewhat uncertain as to what exactly they should believe. But we haven't reached the end of our story at all. These were explosive ideas, but none were as incendiary as those developed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau was among the most radical of the major philosophes, and his book, Le Contrat Social, The Social Contract of 1762, would become the Bible of the French Revolution. Rousseau is an extraordinary individual, and we lack the time to look at his biography in detail. But he wasn't born in France, but in Geneva, the city of John Calvin, and we will return to this because it's important. His father was a locksmith who felt that he needed more representation of his real virtue. He taught his son the classics and apprenticed his son to a printer. But Rousseau, unhappy with any kind of restriction, ran away and moved along the roads of France and Switzerland until, as he tells us in his Confessions in 1748, he read in the Mercure de France an advertisement for a national essay competition that was being offered by the Academy of Dijon. Now, the question for this essay competition was whether the recent advances in science and art had corrupted or purified morals. Rousseau tells us that he thought for a moment as he held the Mercure de France in his hand, and then he threw himself under a tree and wept, because he saw the answer, and he saw the answer was the solution to the problems of humanity. His answer was very interesting. His answer was not what anyone expected. His response was that art and science had corrupted mankind because they destroyed his natural self. He turned Hobbes and Locke on their heads. He argued that man in the state of nature was not living lives solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, but life in the state of nature was happy. Society was the instrument that caused corruption and enslavement and unhappiness. Well, he won the competition, obviously, and he became then the hero of fashionable society. And in an early example of Tom Wolfe's radical chic, he was adopted by aristocratic ladies who had to have him in their salons and at dinner, and also he had to become their lovers as well. One of his aristocratic mistresses set him up in one of her country estates, L'Hermitage. And there in 1762, he wrote some of his most important works. His Émile, his book on education, but most significantly, The Social Contract. The social contract was built upon ideas found in Hobbes and Locke about a contract between rulers and ruled. But Rousseau rejected completely the Hobbesian model, or even Locke's elaboration that made it much more humane and civilized. Rousseau turned the idea around completely. The state of nature was not violent, vicious, and horrible, but rather was the state in which the natural goodness of humanity could operate. When society or government was required, those in a state of nature yielded their individual rights. for the contract, but not to a king, as in Hobbes, but to the whole community. And the community then becomes sovereign in itself. Consequently, he argued that sovereignty resides in the people, and this sovereign will is by definition good, as men and women, by their human nature, by their very definition, their dignity as human beings, wish to do good and avoid evil. And all members of society must yield their individual wills to this general sovereign will, and those who resist must be compelled to submit. His famous line, his dangerous line, was that we must force our brothers to be free. Society itself is a corrupting influence, and again, building to some extent on some of the ideas that would be developed in Montesquieu, that nations become corrupt to the point that they are so alienated from this natural virtue that they needed a fundamental correction. And Rousseau suggests that if you look through history, you will see a lawgiver come. Someone like Moses, or Solon in ancient Greece, or John Calvin. This individual must arise from the people and the traditions of the people and must represent the natural virtue of the people. And this figure is able to restore the collective virtue of the population and of his fellows. He believed that some societies, however, and he pointed to France in particular, as too corrupt to ever be reclaimed. France couldn't be recovered by the intervention of a lawgiver. France was too far along that line of corruption. It couldn't, in fact, ever be restored to any elemental state of virtue. So the only solution was to destroy that society and to start again, so that virtue might once more operate. These ideas should be remembered because when we talk about the revolution in a subsequent lecture, and when we talk about the reign of terror and Robespierre establishing the Republic of Virtue, we really are talking about ideas that are very, very fully developed in Rousseau. And Robespierre and the terror came about as a consequence of the attempt to activate the principles that Rousseau discusses in the Contrat Social. Well, the radical implication of the social contract was that sovereignty was invested in the people, and the people are always right. This, of course, we hear from every defeated politician on election night when he or she says, the people have spoken and the people are always right. Well, it could be quoting Rousseau, in fact, although I doubt very much that they are. And these ideas are also diametrically opposed to the 18th century concepts of sovereignty. The idea that sovereignty resides in the people, in the collectivity of the citizenry, doesn't really exist. Sovereignty resided in kings, for example, and Hobbes saw this, and Hobbes celebrated it in Leviathan. Or sovereignty resided with God. God was the ultimate source of sovereignty, and he chose his magistrates, kings or the consistory in a Swiss city. These were the instruments by which the sovereignty of God then played out in human terms. But Rousseau empowers the people at large. Rousseau offered a dramatic shift of authority within the state. Well, was this enough? Was it sufficient that Rousseau shifted the balance in the nature of government from the ruler to the ruled, where sovereignty resided in the people themselves, who then vested that sovereignty in their representatives, however they may be seen to operate? No, Rousseau never ended when, in fact, he could go a bit farther, and so he did. Rousseau suggested, and this was also clear in his book on education in Emile, that simple people, those without education or cultivation, were in many ways superior. They were actually superior because they were closer to their natural virtuous selves. Rousseau was challenging the very concept of society. In fact, he was challenging almost the concept of civilization. where the cultivation of the individual, the acquisition of a certain set of skills, the acquisition of knowledge would give them greater advantage in ruling over the community, because that basis of knowledge, and someone like Diderot, of course, argued this strongly, would benefit the community because they would be more informed and they could make more rational decisions, having access to more evidence. Well, Rousseau says no. This is not the way it works at all. The more knowledge you have, the more cultivation, the farther you are away from your natural virtue, the natural civilization that comes from being close to the state of nature, where all was free and all was good. So the social contract becomes an odd book in certain ways. It becomes a curious union of freedom and virtue. But it's a virtue that must be enforced. In other words, Rousseau here, and there are many contradictions in the book, but Rousseau is suggesting that virtue cannot operate altogether freely because of the constraints of having to live within a society. So virtue then must be permitted to operate by being enforced by the collectivity of citizens. It's not terribly dissimilar from Thomas More in Utopia, and, of course, not terribly dissimilar at all from John Calvin's Geneva. Freedom becomes the exercise of virtue and the suppression of individual vice. And this, of course, is where we can see the heritage of Rousseau as a Genevan, coming from the city of John Calvin, working out so many of his ideas. Calvin, too, believed, as we saw in a previous lecture, Calvin believed that vice had to be suppressed, and only then could the godly feel comfortable in their society. Well, Rousseau said something very, very similar, but in secular terms. And Rousseau then is in fact activating some of the principles that were animating the Reformation in another revolutionary time, using these principles to achieve certain secular goals that Rousseau saw as necessary for the creation of what he would see as a republic of virtue. Rousseau's solution then was to promote the common good by using the prescriptive powers of the state. And Rousseau's dramatic opening of his book, "Man is born free but is everywhere in chains," becomes a rallying cry for revolutionaries everywhere, seeking the essential freedom of their fellow man, but of course always in their own terms. This idea is to be recovered and it's to be used once more. It becomes one of the rhetorical commonplaces of the vocabulary of revolution, and its single most powerful echo is in Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, because when he wrote, "Workers of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains," he is in fact paraphrasing Rousseau to a large extent. It's been often suggested that the paradoxes of the social contract allow an interpretation in which society would ultimately develop into a totalitarian world in which virtue was imposed, and it was also the text that allowed for the collective freedom and the sovereignty of the community to operate, indicating maximum freedom. It depends on how the material is used. And like so many of the thinkers of the Enlightenment, in their addressing the complex problems of the state in which they were living, they came up with complex and often contradictory solutions. But nevertheless, these solutions provided opportunities for others to take this information and to apply it in the context most useful to them. Well, the immediate influences of Rousseau on the social contract were, of course, devastatingly significant. Voltaire, who was himself an elitist, who was quite happy with the company of kings and princes. He was a friend of Frederick the Great of Prussia. He was a gentleman to the bedchamber of Louis XV, in fact, and got that job through the intervention of the king's mistress and someone who knew that room particularly well. Voltaire was an elitist. He truly believed that the cultivated, educated mind would be the natural leaders of society and the ones most appropriate for the exercise of reason and the application of knowledge. Voltaire, in fact, had written that virtue was incompatible with simple souls. Montesquieu, as we saw, had nightmares of mob rule. The aristocratic baron saw democracy as a great danger because he feared the people, and he believed, in fact, that those who had no property would always act against those who did. So he was very concerned about democracy because of the implicit danger of mob rule. But Rousseau rejected both of them. Rousseau believed that the simple soul and the will of the people, especially simple people, was in fact the panacea, the route to a new, vigorous, egalitarian society. Rousseau saw the simple people, the common people, as being the instruments by which virtue could be restored, by which new governments could be created, and a new concept of the state actually defined. Indeed, if you want to think of the tags of the revolution, liberty, fraternity, and equality, they to a degree really do represent Rousseau's thought, at least as stated in the social contract. Rousseau, in fact, became the ideologue of the revolution, and the social contract became, in fact, the Bible of that revolution. The revolution broke out a decade after his death, but he had done a great deal to actually determine many of its actions. He provided the justification for the Reign of Terror. He also provided the justification for the concept of popular sovereignty that would be ultimately experimented with in the establishment of the French state. But nevertheless, Rousseau was offering something else. He was offering a corrective to many of the Enlightenment perspectives that were driven by an elitist, aristocratic perspective that saw a new kind of elite, not an aristocratic elite of birth and power, but an elite of the mind, an elite of aristocrats of learning and those who believed that they had the answer to social problems to be in a position in order to create a different sort of society based on principles that reflected Enlightenment values. Rousseau's corrective then was not top-down, but bottom-up. And in so doing, he created a different kind of tension, a tension that we're going to see being worked out in the 19th century and after the Revolution, between these two perspectives. A somewhat paternalistic view that we can see in Montesquieu, we can see in Voltaire, we can see even in Diderot. A set of paternalistic views that could identify the best and create a new society, a kind of utopia, based upon the application of ideas by an intellectual elite. Whereas Rousseau saw the solution from the bottom. Those who were closest to the problems in society could in fact come up with their own solutions, acting collectively, and impose those on the society, including on those who had other opinions and would like to dissent. So we see, in fact, the society of Europe and the mind of Europe already becoming bifurcated, divided between those aristocratic perspectives, those elitist perspectives, those paternalistic perspectives, and those who saw popular solutions based upon the will of the people, the sovereignty of the people, which must always be correct in its collective virtue. This would characterize very much the 19th century, but its roots were very much in the Enlightenment. We will see, in fact, how this Enlightenment dichotomy will work out not just in the political movements and philosophical perspectives, but also in the function of government itself. The Enlightenment, then, was not just a series of individuals, privileged individuals, writing about a world that they hoped would improve because of their involvement in it and the ideas they were putting forth. It also was a time that began to define the vocabulary and the movements and the actions. It began to define the ideologies that would characterize European society in some ways up to the very present. That conflict between bottom-up and top-down, that conflict between an elite who will describe and define what is best for the community and those who actually live in the community and say that the experience of their collective wisdom is greater, is something that is still seen in European politics to this day. The Enlightenment, then, provided the foundation for society as it exists to this day. The Enlightenment is our collective gift. It's our collective perspective, and it provided not only the ideological, but also the intellectual and the cultural weapons still used in the cultural wars that we continue to fight. And regardless which side we choose to adhere to, that debate will not easily be ended because they represent two fundamentally different perspectives on how the world should be constructed and how human society can behave in a most civilized manner and for the greatest good, for the greatest number.